very interesting case. And like you saw, we discussed this case a few years ago for those who were here then when we did the crime and consequence story. And just to make this a little bit easier watching, and why is it not sharing? I apologize. For some reason it's not sharing our screen. Okay. Sorry, YouTubers. We'll be back in a second. This story, and for those of you who didn't get a chance to watch it, I'll quickly recap the story just to bring everybody up to date of what's been happening. Okay, so we just showed a video, and for some reason we were having trouble streaming the video, so for those who did watch the video, I apologize boring you. But the story was the case of a lady named Kitty Genovese. And she was a young Italian-American woman living in Kew Gardens area in New York. It's in Queens. If you know New York well, New York is divided by 5 boroughs, 5 major neighborhoods. And this story, the video described, happened in 1964. Now, 9 years earlier, alarmed by the increasing violence that was going on in other neighborhoods, her parents moved to Connecticut. And New York was starting in the 50s already, although it was good that it was becoming a melting pot and all the other benefits that come with that. But the problems were also great, and that was the violence and crime. And unfortunately, that was a major issue that New York is facing. So this young lady, Kitty, she did not move to the suburbs, to Connecticut, where her parents moved. She decided to stay put in New York, living there in Queens. And now she worked at a bar not too far from her home. Now in the early hours, the video described March 31st, this month, 1964. It's exactly 58 years ago. After closing up the bar, Kitty just wanted to close her eyes and get some shut-eye. What do you call it? There's another name for it. Pardon? Shut-eye. There you go. She wanted to sleep. It was 3:15 in the morning. And after parking her car in the parking lot outside her home, she stepped out and headed towards the door. When suddenly, a man named on the video as Winston Mosley, something like that, he burst out of the shadows. With a scream, Kitty staggered back and began to run across the silent parking lot. But he was already upon her. And Mosley stabbed her twice in the back, but somehow she still broke free. She managed to cry out, "Oh my God!" This guy stabbing her and begging for help. That's the story as it was going, and people are watching, as the video showed. People hear her noise. Yes, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, but she's screeching. It's an apartment complex. It's an urban area. It was cold outside. Indeed, in March in New York is the end of winter. It's still cold. And yet, nobody did a thing. Nobody came out. And he attacked her further. And even though she continued to run from him after being stabbed in the back, she's running. She collapsed in the hallway of the building. There are witnesses. People are watching. According to eyewitnesses, 10 minutes passed and nobody came out. This guy ran away, but he came back to his victim. And she tried to defend herself even though she was on the ground. Nobody's come to her rescue. And now he stabbed her again, assaulted her, emptied out her wallet, and escaped with all her money, $49 that she had. And finally, some of the neighbors eventually emerged from their apartments, and that's when they called the police, or tried to attend to her wounds. Emergency ambulances came, which, by the way, in New York were notoriously slow for many years, and that's what caused and inspired Hatzalah to start. Hatzalah started around that very time. My father was from the very first members of Hatzalah, which is part of what influenced me to join Hatzalah here. But Hatzalah started around that time when a Jew collapsed in a shul once, and they called the city ambulance, and by the time they came, the guy was dead. So it started off with people trying to get trained in CPR and basic techniques on how to save lives. And ultimately, that led to the formation of Hatzalah, where volunteers got together, being trained as medics and rescuing, saving lives. So, here is a New York Times article that I have here about this story that the ambulance came, they took her to the hospital, and she died. Now, about 2 weeks later, in this New York Times write-up of this murder story that shocked America, and as you saw in the film, there's been a lot of lessons that were learned from it. I forget what the film said, but there's a name for it that they called it. Anyone remember? I could Google it quickly, but who paid attention and watched the video? There was a name that they called it, that there's an effect. The bystander effect. Thank you very much. That's what I was looking for. The bystander effect. That's really what we're going to be discussing here today, this bystander effect and its impact, because obviously there's lessons we need to learn from the story. But what the article and what the study highlighted was how many people watched the attack, how many people saw everything going on, and yet, what did they do? Zilch, garnished, okay? And what did people say? I didn't want to mix in, right? I didn't want to mix in. So, according to some, they say there were no less than 30-something people who actually watched this incident. From their windows, from somewhere or another. And how many interfered? Nobody. So this story, and so many others like it over the years, raises a question. What responsibility do I have towards others? Right? Am I required to assist them in their time of need? What is my obligation? What is my responsibility? What would you say it is? Right? You're driving on the highway. You see a car accident. Should you do anything better to say, not my business? What is the question that this is not just a new question? It's a question that goes all the way back to the beginning of history. A question that God asked Cain, Aye Hevel achicha, where is Hevel, your brother? And what does Cain say? You know why I walk with a cane? Because I'm not able. Oh, sorry. What did he say? Am I my brother's keeper? So this is a question that's discussed. I have a few texts in front of me today that I'm going to read to you from, and we'll get into the Megillah to make this relevant to our preparations for Purim. So there's a question that's mentioned in a journal. Okay, this is a journal that says as follows. I'm not sure if the journal is called Asia Journal or Asya Journal. Either way, Asya Journal. Maybe that's what it is. Anyways, it says that Western jurists do not believe that a person can be made to act positively in order to rescue someone else. As Hall explains, Hall is I'm not sure who Hall is, I guess some theorist. And the theorist Hall says, we do not believe that every man must be his brother's keeper. So how do you answer the question that God asked Cain? Aye Hevel achicha, where's Hevel your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Well, the first response that Dr. Eliezer ben Shlomo in the Asiya Journal quotes from the philosophy of whole is, we don't believe that every person is their brother's keeper. You do not have responsibility to look after other people's concerns and needs and worries. It's not what do you have to get worried about? By show of hands here, who agrees with whole? Wow. Just a second. I need to show our illustrious crowd. Nobody's raising their hand. Nobody here agrees with whole. How do you like that? What's that? Hall says we don't believe that we are our brother's keeper. That we have to take responsibility for another person. So, yeah. Who was I reading? I mean, just the other day I was reading about an instance of a story that happened a year or two ago, somewhere in America. I don't remember which state. I could look up the story. You read so much information, how much of it sticks, right? We talk about that a lot. I really don't even remember where I read it, but I'm remembering. It was Saturday night. I was reading something for some reason. And a story that happened in the U.S. recently, where a mother dropped off her kids at their school. In some of these huge school campuses, there's a lot of cars coming in and people are dropping off their kids. For some reason, this kid wasn't noticed by the next car and got run over. And for whatever reason, this kid wasn't too bad. It was just a small, and the kid tried to crawl her way back to the pavement to try to save herself. But she was crawling and the next car didn't see. And the next car now dragged her 50 feet. Okay? And now, still more cars drove by. And the person who was observing this and wanted to do something is describing, this child didn't make it after being dragged by the next car, but was describing the indifference. That it was like a dead dog lying on the street. And nobody stopped, nobody cared, nobody did a thing. And this was modern day America. And people were just too busy. They have work to get to. They have appointments. They have meetings. Sadly, I remember one of the first funerals I officiated as a rabbi. So I got my smicha here 18 years ago in Pretoria, and I go back to New York, and I got a job then at a hotel. Clever Jewish family that didn't want to go through all the red tape of opening a retirement village, because there's a lot of laws, rules, regulations that you have to go through. It's easier to open a hotel. I might do the same thing. And anyways, they decided to open a hotel, but most of their clientele were all wealthy Jewish families. It was a very expensive place. I think the starting price was $5,000. That's like 75,000 rand a month. It was very nice. It was on the beach. Anyways, why am I mentioning this? There was an old man, Manny. I remember this Yid. A lot of stories I could tell you about him, but not today. But Manny passed away. I saw him Shabbos afternoon. And that Saturday night, I had a flight out of New York to Florida for my nephew's upshernish. Or it wasn't his upshernish, it was some occasion, a friend's wedding. So I flew to Florida. When I arrived in Miami, in Fort Lauderdale Airport, I see on my phone a lot of missed calls. No WhatsApp in those days. So I returned the calls. It was quite late at night. It was like 11 o'clock at night. I figured, if these people are trying to reach me, obviously it's something urgent. I called them back. And it was Manny's daughter. They told me, unfortunately, Manny passed away. Of course, I was very saddened. I said, how could that be? I just saw him this afternoon. He was at my shiur. I used to give a shiur every Shabbos afternoon to the residents of this hotel. They said, no, listen, he was very old. He was, if I recall, he was close to centenarian. And he had a heart attack, and he didn't make it. It was quite sad because I just saw him that afternoon. So I said to the family, I'm very close with him. Can I turn back for the funeral? When's it going to be? Where is it taking place? They said, actually, we called to inform you that Manny wanted you as his rabbi to officiate the funeral. I said, okay, I'm here. I'm in the airport. I could get on the next plane back. And they said to me, no. We're very busy. They were all important business executives. And they said, we're not going to do the funeral now. We're going to do it next weekend. Because he has a brother in Montreal, and the brother had to get from Montreal. Montreal's a 7-hour drive at the max, and maybe a 1-hour flight from New York. And I could get back on the plane. It will only take me 2 hours to get back there. No, they're very busy. unfortunate when, here's this guy, Manny, who unfortunately, he was a Holocaust survivor and everything went through. I think he was very wealthy. And in his later life, as an old man at this retirement hotel, he was returning to his roots, and that's how he connected with me and was connected to his Yiddishkeit. But sadly, his kids did not really have it, and they didn't have the values. Their value was money. Their value was business. Their value was, we have work this week, we'll take care of Dad's funeral at the end of the week. So it was. I stayed in Miami for the week. I was in touch with them. I discussed things. I won't even go through all the details of that funeral, because that was a very peculiar funeral to get thrown into the deep end of officiating funerals. I have to say that our South African Jewish community is a lot more traditional. And thank God even the least observant people know a lot more and have a lot more respect for the dead. These people, their respect was business. When I came and did the funeral and afterwards they had like it was like a wake, and in Judaism that would be allowed. I mean, they had a limousine pick me up from the airport when I arrived back in New York. And the limousine took me. They had caterers with food. I don't know what they had. Snails. That's got to go. And then they had Shiva. I told them about Shiva. They weren't planning to do Shiva because they're very busy. But they said they could do it over the weekend because we did the funeral Friday afternoon. So I said, look, you're off the hook because Jewish law prohibits mourning on Shabbos. So you'll only do the Shiva then on Sunday. Okay. I came. It was like a bar mitzvah. It was a party. And they made sure to out of consideration for me, they got kosher catering in. I said, this is not what a Shiva is supposed to be. The truth is, even locally here, sometimes I go to a Shiva, and I want to tell the people, Shiva is not a party. Okay? But anyways, be it as it may, I didn't mean to get all to digress and talk about Shivas. Talking about the priority of money. And I gave you this other story that happened more recently, somewhere in the States, where this kid was run over, and the kid tried crawling back to the pavement and could have saved her life if it wasn't for this situation where people were just too busy to notice. Yeah, bracha. Personal story, yes? Can I turn the screen around so everybody can hear you tell the story? Go ahead. Tell the story. Yeah, sometimes it's out of false piety. Sometimes a situation like that is not false piety. I shouldn't say that, but sometimes it's misplaced piety. Let's call it. In a situation where people are being, they don't know. For example, let me tell you a picture or even a story I heard this weekend. A lot of the shluchim, a lot of the Chabad emissaries are trying to get out of Ukraine and saving people in Dnepropetrovsk. That's a big city in Ukraine where there's a major Chabad presence. It's the largest Jewish center in the world. They set up an emergency crisis management room. And in this room on Shabbos, you could see rabbis wearing their Shabbos clothing, and they're on phones and on their big screen, and they are working on evacuation plans for Jews from Kiev and Kharkov and what other city was yesterday? There were some other cities that were that are under attack. What city is Rebbetzin Lieberov's sister living in? The Levitanskis. So some major cities, Chernigov. These cities are. Pardon?
Mariupol.
Mariupol. Okay, and they have to get these people out of there on Shabbos. Somebody says to me, on Shabbos, rabbis are on their phone. I heard from one of my colleagues yesterday. He's in a different city. He's one in Chernigov. He was on his phone a whole Shabbos, and his daughter says, Tati, she's never seen her father on the phone on a Shabbos. Well, I mean, this doesn't feel like Shabbos to me. And he said, I know it doesn't feel like Shabbos, but Jewish law requires that on Shabbos, if God forbid such a situation happens, you save lives. You know, Rabbi Chazdan, it's my uncle, and he's the rabbi at the Great Park Shul. He said once there was a very sad situation. A couple of years ago, there was it's on a big street. Is it Glenhove Road? What is it called? Pretoria? I think it's Glenhove Road. And unfortunately, one of the members were walking out of shul, walking across his car, or crossing the street, whatever it was, and got hit by a vehicle. And there were a lot of bystanders, and most of them probably had their phones, but none of them grabbed their phones. People were in shock. The rabbi had to run back into the shul to get his phone and call Hatzalah and call the police because people didn't take action. So in that situation, I would say people sometimes just don't realize, and maybe they don't know what to do. Yeah. Shock sometimes. True. Yeah. True. So let's get back into our story here, because this story is the one that I want to bring into the... go ahead.
The story about the funeral in New York, surely you know that
Jewish law does not allow postponement of a funeral more than 3 days. First of all, I was a rookie. I was a new-come rabbi. I didn't know. I went by the plan of the funeral home. The funeral home, they charge more money every day of freezer storage. Even myself, when my father passed away 2 years ago, those of you remember, I was right here at the shir, and I see a phone call from my sister. I was shocked. Why was my sister calling me? It's 4:30 in the morning in New York this time. And all she said is Baruch Dayan Emes. I said, what on earth are you talking about? And then she told me about my father's passing. I was frightened. So anyways, I told them, you don't have to delay the funeral for me. I'll get on a plane. I'll get there. But she did. They decided to accommodate all of us. So my father passed away late Tuesday night, early, was it like 4 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday. And the funeral was very late on Thursday. It was about 5:30. Why? Because they waited for myself, in South Africa to come, my brother in Australia to come, my sister from Israel to come. So I had family around the world who all had to come to the funeral. So they decided to accommodate, and it's a matter of respect. So it's something that the funeral home, the Chaver Kaddish have to determine how long they would wait, but not 5 days. Here this guy passed away Saturday evening, and they waited all the way till Friday afternoon to do the funeral. So our Chaver Kaddish would not do that. The Chaver Kaddish there was not Orthodox, and they didn't follow Jewish law. There were a lot of other things that I noticed they did that weren't following Jewish law. For example, again, not to digress so far, I told the family about the Jewish custom of ripping kriya, that when one loses a loved one, that we tear our shirt on the left side next to our heart, as symbolically showing the idea that we're brokenhearted, but it's an actual representation of it in our shirt. And I told this to the family. What did this family do? I see they arrived at the funeral wearing their best, their finest tuxedos, like they're going to a wedding. I figured, okay, they must be very wealthy. I mean, as far as I understood already, they were very wealthy, and they didn't mind ripping their fancy clothes. But when it came time to rip kriya, what did they do? They gave out ribbons, these little ribbons. But they decided, why should only the children rip kriya? Let's give it to everybody. Everyone should rip kriya. You see, yesterday we finished writing a Torah in our shul, and I shared a little insight from the Rebbe's father about, in the middle of the book of Devarim, the Torah tells us, Bal Tosif, do not add to the Torah, do not subtract from the Torah. Why does the Torah have to tell us this? The Torah gives us 613 commandments. What if somebody says, I love Shabbos so much. In fact, I want to add Shabbos onto Sunday and onto Monday and onto Tuesday. Shabbos is wonderful. But guess what? Don't add to the Torah. The Torah says Shabbos is Friday night from sunset to stars out. Yes, there is a concept of Tosefes Shabbos, of adding someone onto Shabbos. But even for that, our sages give us the guidelines. You can't bring in Shabbos on Tuesday. Okay? I knew a guy who was so from this fellow. Yeah, he would bring in Shabbos so early on Tuesday. Now the Torah says you can't be so from. Okay? The Torah says you can't add on. This guy, not only did he wear a yarmulke, he wore a shaitel under his yarmulke. You can't add on to the Torah. This guy, he was so from on Shabbos, he didn't even let his voice carry on Shabbos, okay? That's how from he was. Okay. Don't be so extra from. You don't have to add all these extras to the Torah, okay? That's not what the Torah says. Don't add to the Torah. And also don't subtract from the Torah. So the vart I shared from the Rebbe's father about that was not to add, not to subtract. What's the first letter of the Torah? It's a Beis, Bereshit. What's the last letter of the Torah? It's a Lamed. The word Yisrael, which we concluded writing yesterday for this beautiful new Torah that we added to our shul. So here is the insight. Don't subtract. What is the subtraction of Beis? What do you go back one letter? Aleph. Go back one letter from Lamed. What letter do you get? Chaf. What does the Aleph and Chaf spell? The word Ach. What does Ach mean? However, Ach, brothers with a Ches. With a Chaf means but. However. So a person could say, I love Judaism so much. I know the Torah says to keep kosher, but I think prawns should also be kosher. I think, or I don't like this rule. So I'm going to take that one off and the other one off. Now I understand not everybody's up to keeping all 613 commandments of the Torah, and not everybody could do it. There's a story I told you long ago about the previous Rebbe, that he met with a group of students, and he said to them, listen, I'm the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I don't keep all the Torah. Why? Practically speaking, it's impossible to. Some laws are only relevant to a Kohen. Some laws are only to a Levi. Some laws are only in Israel. Some laws are only for men. Some laws are only for women. Some laws are divorce. Divorce is a mitzvah in the Torah. Does that mean every person has to get divorced? Even though it's one of the 613. If you want to keep all 613 commandments, guess what you have to do? You have to be a man and you have to be a woman. You have to be a Kohen, you have to be a Levi. You have to live in Israel, you have to be out of Israel. You have to be in the times of the you have to get married, you have to get divorced. You have to die, that's not all 613 commandments are practically possible to be observed. Just realistically speaking. Not only that, but even the ones you could keep, which is probably only 20%. It's not feasible that every person could do it all. It's just so much. Said the Rebbe to these students, I try to do as much as I can and a little bit more. You do as much as you can and a little bit more. Right? Don't subtract though. Don't say it's not relevant to me. Don't say kosher is out of fashion, out of style. Just because you're struggling with that mitzvah. We're not going to now endorse not keeping kosher. I understand it. It's a struggle. Try your best. Try to keep kosher at home. Okay, now try to go to only kosher restaurants. But don't subtract it. Don't say I don't have to keep kosher. Or whatever other mitzvah it might be. Ach. The word before Baal, if you're going to subtract the letter Beis, you get an Aleph. The letter before Lamed is Chaf. That's Ach. Don't create buts to the Torah. Don't decide when the Torah is not relevant to you. The Torah already gave us the rules of when it's not relevant. For example, saving a life of Shabbos. It's not that you could break Shabbos to save a life. Part of the laws of keeping Shabbos is that you could break Shabbos to save a life. So really you didn't break Shabbos. You're keeping Shabbos by breaking Shabbos. You understand? It's part of the rule of Shabbos. And then, Bal Tosif, don't add. How do you add? What's the letter after Beis? Gimel. What's the letter after Lamed? What word does that spell? Gam. What does Gam mean? And also. Don't start adding to the Torah. Torah says, keep Shabbos on Saturday. I also think we should keep it on Sunday and Monday. No, don't add. Okay? Yes, there are rabbinic enactments. That's not adding to the Torah. That is the guidelines of our sages the Torah telling us about the importance of following the words of our sages. And we distinguish between rabbinic law and Torah law. Right? So now, how did we get into all this? I don't remember.
We're talking about the funeral.
The funeral. Don't add, don't subtract. We're giving out the ribbons. Yeah, let everybody have a ribbon. Anyways, and then cut the ribbon. Don't start changing the rules of the Torah because you like it, because you feel. And unfortunately, sometimes our emotions and feelings get in. I've seen this very, very many times. Even, and there are times and a place for everything. I remember during COVID, a family that I was officiating a funeral, they came from overseas. It's not people you know. I'm not going to be maligning anyone. Without going into details, I unfortunately officiated very many funerals during COVID, way too many. And this person was part of my Shabbos visits that I would send volunteers, and I knew the family came from overseas, and it was during July. It was like during one of those times when COVID was really heavy, and they wanted to do the shiva in their deceased apartment, the deceased person's apartment, and I said to them, that's not a good idea. First of all, shuls are closed. Right? No, we want to do it because it's meaningful, it's purposeful, it's where she lived. I said, don't do that. We're during COVID now. We're during the height of the pandemic. People are very sick. You feel that it's nice to do this. Yes, Shiva is an important, to observe, for you as the family to observe Shiva. But you don't have to do this, that it's going to cause now a problem, that we're going to expose others, make more other people vulnerable. You have to know that Judaism is not a religion just of the heart. It has to be a combination, like we discussed last week, of the mind and the heart. And yes, you need the heart, you need the feeling, you need the passion, you need that enthusiasm and excitement and commitment and dedication. But you have to know to use Torah law as well and know where it applies. So going back to the story, right? In order to understand the story of Kitty Genovese, I asked you about the very beginning in the Torah where God asks Hevel, God asks Cain, Aye Hevel Lechicha, where is Hevel your brother? And Cain's response was, Hashomer Achi Anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Now we of course know that in the case of Cain, the real issue was not that he did not act in order to save his brother Hevel, Abel, but that he actually acted to murder, to kill his brother. You know that story? Remember, it's one of the first stories of the Torah. I related it on Shabbos and Shul because I read a very interesting commentary that said that our Parsha, we just concluded the book of Shemos. We read for the last 5 weeks all about the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. First, the instruction to build it in Teruma. And then we read about the actual building of it. Before we get to the building, we get the instruction of the building. And then the instruction of all the accoutrements and everything else and the vessels. And then we went into the actual building of it. Now, in this week's Parsha Vayikra, we're going to get into the service in the temple, right? This week's Parsha is all about the sacrifices that were offered in the temple, in the Mishkan. But one of the commentaries tells us that the book of Shemos is a parallel to the book of Bereshis. In Bereshis, God creates the world. And what happens? Right away, man decides to disobey, to betray God. Adam and Eve, the very first day, don't listen to Hashem. Then Cain kills Abel. Then the story of Noah, the flood. Why was there a flood? Because the world became corrupted. And then the Tower of Babel. And then the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember all that. And in the book of Shemos, we're reading about how God rescues the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. Wonders and miracles, left and right. Takes them out with an outstretched arm. Splits the sea. Gives them the Torah on Mount Sinai. And they betray God. They worship a golden calf. So God says, I want you now to take the chaos that you caused, that you created. When you insisted that Aaron give you all the gold and you're going to create this golden calf. And you're going to turn it into order. Because when God created the world, there was an order. And the people turned it into chaos. Now I want you to reverse that and turn that chaos back into order. So in the instance of Cain and Abel, we know that not only did Cain, was he basically dodging the bullet? Was he trying to, what's the term for it, where you're not taking the blame, not being accountable, passing the buck? He's moving forward. I don't know what you're talking about, my brother's keeper. But apparently somehow imagining that God wasn't omniscient, that Cain feigned ignorance of murdering his brother, pretending he has no clue. What are you talking about? I don't know. Right? You ever do that? And he also contested the notion that he had any duty to know of his brother's whereabouts or welfare. And certainly not to actively care for his brother. Now, there's no question regarding the immorality of Cain's behavior. We all agree. The fact that the Torah includes this story obviously is for us to learn. Why does the Torah, if the Torah wanted to just show how pristine, how righteous, how pious, how wonderful our ancestors were, the Torah could have just told us the nice stories. Why does the Torah tell us the story of Cain killing his brother Abel? Because obviously there are lessons and messages for us to learn from that too. But there's also no denying that the defense that Cain offers, even, the fact that he says, we all understand that it is good to help others, right? We all know that we should act beneficially. We should all act kindly, generously, sensitively, caringly, compassionate. But my question is there a moral obligation, or should a person be required to help someone else in need? What are your thoughts? Let's say you're driving down the road and you see something going on, right? So, personal case. I'm driving with my kids down the M1 highway on a Friday afternoon, and we saw a shootout on the M1. For those of you watching this abroad, welcome to the Wild West. Sorry, to Africa. Okay, this is not a daily occurrence, but I saw it. Okay, do I have to do something about it? See a car accident, God forbid. Do you do something about it? Do you have an obligation to pull over to call for help? Do so safely? Is it your responsibility to get involved? Okay. Let me ask you another question. Let's just see what's going on with our slides. Like in this story here of Kitty Genovese, where so many people saw the story, and yet people did not get involved. So the question I ask you is, what is our responsibility? Do we bear any responsibility? Is it optional, or is it obligatory for us to get involved? And I'm going to give you maybe a little bit of a more, call it a thornier question, not just about a car accident, but let's take it a step further. A kid falls into the water, okay? You know how to swim, but it's a stormy day. Say it's on the, at the pier, and conditions are dangerous. Do you have an obligation to put yourself at risk to save this child? To what degree do you have a responsibility to get involved? Well, that's why I'm giving you a more dangerous situation. It's a fire. Do you have an obligation to go into a fire to try to help save somebody in there? There's smoke inhalation. You might get burned by the fire. Now there'll be another victim. And you're not a trained firefighter. Why am I mentioning this situation? Because next week is Purim. Pardon? Absolutely. So that's the question. Do you have your own life? Are you allowed to put your own life at risk? Now, I think this is a conversation we might have to continue tomorrow's shiur. But with this introduction, we are prepared to launch into the story of Purim. Because this very dilemma expresses itself in one of the Megillah's most dramatic moments. In a sense, this scene is the pivotal point of the entire story. If I can ask somebody, in fact, to bring me a Megillah. Anyone want to volunteer? Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want a Megillah because I want to find the exact words. I could look for it on my phone, but it's probably easier for me. Yeah, let me share it with you. I want to look at it inside the Megillah itself. So if anybody doesn't mind to bring me a Megillah, Ronnie, if you don't mind, you can take a Chumash. Okay, just give me a minute. So in the story of the Megillah, thank you so much, Ronnie. I want to just look at something here and share it with you. Now, the first 3 chapters, we have the dramatic build-up of the story that we're going to read next week. Right? Everything in place. What happens? King Achashverosh, you know the song we learned as kids, the whole story. Made a great feast. He called his wife Vashti to come. She had many pimples, 100 at least. She said, I can't join in your fun. The king got so angry, he said to his guards, take her. I don't want her. She's mean. I learned this 40 years ago in school. Of all the maidens that Shushan town had, Esther became the new queen. Now I'm moving on to the next chapter. All of a sudden things start changing. It was good for the Jews and now it's getting a little bit not so pleasant for the Jews. Haman told everyone, bow down to me. But Mordechai said, no, that I'll never do. Okay, now there's trouble brewing in Shushan. What's going on? Esther's the new queen. She wins the beauty contest. She becomes the Jewish Persian queen. Okay, it's not so far-fetched. We have a Jewish president in Ukraine today. I believe there was a Jewish prime minister in New Zealand a couple of years ago. It's possible that Jewish people could get into these positions, even though it seems somewhat far-fetched. We're such a minority in the world. But it's part of the Jewish way of life, of being so ambitious, and Jews can make it up into their, the story of Zelensky, the Jewish president. Somebody asked his mother, you must be very proud of your son there, look what he's doing. She says, you should know my other kids, the Nachas, one's a doctor, one's a lawyer. So one's a president, right? But what happens? Haman, this anti-Semite, he's causing trouble, and he wants to annihilate the Jewish people, as you all know the story. And Esther's cousin, Mordechai, discovers this plot. And what does he do? He sends a message to Esther, who's hiding her identity from the king. So the king doesn't even know that he's married to a Jewess. I want to read to you some verses. Vatikra Esther lasach Nesirisi hamelech asher hemid lefaneha. All right, maybe I shouldn't read it all to you. My voice is a little hoarse from yesterday. But what happens in the Megillah? Esther summoned Hasach, one of the king's chamberlains, and that whom he had appointed before her to take care of Esther. And what happens? She commanded him concerning Mordechai, Ladas mazeh al mazeh, to know what is this? Why was this? What's going on? Tell me. Let me read the next verse to you. Mordechai went out to find out. What happens? And she's going to find out what's happening, what's going on. So Mordechai told him everything that had befallen him and the full account. Asher Amar Haman Lishkel Al Ginzei HaMelech Bayudim Le'Avdam, that he had proposed to weigh out in the king's treasuries on the Jews' account, that Haman had the final solution. That Haman was going to pay for the extinction, for the annihilation of the Jewish nation. Let me read one more verse to you. That's Pashegan Ksavados Asher Nitan Shoshanash Midam San Lohi La Roises Esther La Hagidla. And he presented a copy of this plot, of the decree that was given in Shushan to destroy the Jewish nation. And he said to Asach, you show this to Esther. I want Esther to know what's going on. And tell her, plead with her to go to the king and to beseech him, because after all she has a connection, to beg him for her people. For her people. She's a Jew. She knows what situation her nation is facing. She should go to the king because the king gave his stamp of approval for this genocide. And despite what you hear, Mordechai's desperation, his cry for help on behalf of the Jewish people, how quick was Esther at agreeing to fulfill Mordechai's request? Esther said to Asach, and she ordered him to tell Mordechai. What does she say? She says, you go tell my uncle. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that Asher Kalish Veisha, that anyone, any man or woman, who thinks they could approach this king, husband of mine, who comes and is not summoned, then guess what? You know what his fate is? There's one law for him. And what is that? Execution. Unless the king will extend to that person his golden, what do you call it? Scepter. Only then will that person be granted life. And listen to her words. What a wife. Va'ani, but as for me, lo ini kreisi lavaya melech ze shloishim yom. You know why he loved her? He hardly saw her. He said, she says, Esther, my husband has not even seen me in 30 days. Now you want me to go to him unsummoned? Now, things obviously aren't so simple in the royal Persian court. Esther's telling her cousin, uncle, I don't know if Mordechai was her cousin or uncle, it seems, because in some places she's referred to as Bas Dodo, her cousin, but according to some commentaries, he was her uncle. Now it's possible to keep your uncle and cousin. In Jewish law, you're allowed to marry a niece. I think. I'm almost sure. And niece. Sarah was the niece of Abraham, and cousin, I think. In many instances, it's possible to be. Now, can you tell me how it's possible to be a niece and a cousin? Okay, figure it out. Either way, whether she was cousin or niece. You don't simply walk into the king whenever you want. Not even if you're his wife. That's the way it appears. Right? Even the queen has to be summoned, according to the narrative that we're told right here in the Megillah. And after a full month of not being summoned, Esther didn't think that her chances were that great of surprise visiting her husband. Maybe he'll do to her what he did to his previous wife, to Queen Vashti. Remember what happened to her? She refused to come in her birthday suit to the party he threw. Bam! He killed her at the advice of Haman. You see, this guy Achashverosh was a madman because he killed his first wife, Vashti, by the advice of his assistant, Haman. And then he killed his assistant, Haman, by the advice of his new wife, Esther. So it's like he's a drunkard. Anyways, from Mordechai's perspective, from Mordechai's response, he appears to be shocked by Esther's lack of enthusiasm to go into her husband. Listen to his words as we'll continue reading in the Megillah here. And it seems like he is completely shocked. He's completely, give me a better word to describe his feeling of dismay and her indifference. What do you mean you can't go to your husband? What do you mean you haven't been called in 30 days? At this critical moment, how could you not be prepared to go into him even if it means you might be executed? And this is where we get back to our Kitty Genovese case. Or any example. He seems completely crackled with her, this indignation. Now, we obviously have to examine the circumstance, the situation. You understand that Achashverosh is a madman. He might kill his wife. And yet Mordechai does not seem moved by it. Let me read to you another verse. After Hasach, after it says here, so obviously there was more than just Hasach. It seems that Esther's chamberlains, or whatever you call these helpers, they go back and they tell Mordechai, they tell that Esther is not so keen to go into her husband. And what does Mordechai say? Mordechai said, this is what you tell Queen Esther. Al tidami b'nafsheich. Do not imagine that you will escape this, you're better than the rest of us, in this final solution for the Jewish nation. You're a Jewess too. You think you live in the palace, so you'll be better off than the rest of the Jews? No way, Jose. Listen to his words and the tone. My dear niece, cousin Esther, whatever your relationship is to me, Queen Esther. If you will remain silent at this time, then I'll tell you something. You think you won't do something. Guess what? We are a unique nation. We don't only survive, we thrive. If you want to help out, it will come from another place. And now he blackmails her, or so it seems. He says, and you and your father's house, Tovedu will perish. Tovedu will be finished. And who even knows? Why do you think you're the wife, you're the queen? Perhaps this is the whole reason you were put into this position to begin with. You think you're the queen because of your good looks, Esther? Why do you think God made you so pretty? So you see, Mordechai gets tough on her. And is she influenced? Is she moved by his words? Absolutely. And she moves into action very quickly. She moves into motion. Right? Mordechai is very stern in his response to her. And all of a sudden she gets straight into this. She doesn't procrastinate. She right away gets into movement. And suddenly she's up for the challenge. A minute ago, she says, you don't understand what it's like. There's red tape. My husband, if he doesn't put out his golden scepter, even if you're his pretty darling wife, you could walk out with your head chopped off. And all of a sudden, she turns around. She develops a whole plan of action. She asks one thing. What does she want to the Jewish people? Please pray and fast for 3 days, right? So basically, Esther declares that now she's prepared, she's up for the task. Let's go into the next verse. She tells Mordechai, okay, he says, I want you to go and gather all the Jewish people who are present in this capital city of Shushan. I want them to fast on my behalf. They mustn't eat or drink for 3 whole days and nights. And I too, and my maidservants will also be part of this fast. And then I will go to the king unsummoned. And if I'm executed, then so will it be. She changed. She makes a whole about turn. So let me ask you, if Esther really did have these reservations, these concerns about her ability to help, all of a sudden Mordechai threatens her, her family will be lost, and that gets her to, what does he say? Okay, you don't want to help, we'll get help elsewhere. Who didn't realize? So Malcolm says maybe Esther didn't realize how dire the situation was. We didn't realize in Ukraine last week how dire the situation would become. Right? Now you would expect a woman of Esther's righteousness. Esther wasn't just a pretty looking Jewess. She was a righteous woman. Yeah, but maybe she would be moved more by altruism. Maybe she should not. This sounds like self-preservation, a threat. He says, you and your family's house, your father's household will be lost. Ooh, you threatened me. Okay, you blackmailed, you manipulated me. That's the word. You manipulated me. Now I'm in for the job, for the task.
I think once she realized the severity of it, she capitulated.
So she conceded, she capitulated, you're saying, because she realized the severity of the task, of what's going on. But he used some sharp words. He said, you and your father's household will be lost. So now all of a sudden there's a matter of self-preservation, perhaps. But if she wasn't just trying to save her own skin, what were the grounds of her opposition? Why was she hesitant? What were her reservations about to begin with?
Afraid.
If she was afraid, why all of a sudden now is she not afraid?
She was afraid for herself, not she knew that she had everybody else's.
She had the backing, she had support.
Now she knew she had the responsibility to save the Jewish nation, not just herself.
She did. It wasn't just herself. But I think Mordechai made it quite clear to begin with when he said that. He said that, if you don't do something about it, then you and your father's household will be lost. So here's our first thing. First, Esther says, I wasn't summoned for 30 days. Mordechai's response is, if you remain silent at this time, then Revach v'atzala yamad la'Yehudim mimamakim achad, and relief and rescue will arise for the Jews from elsewhere. Atu ve'savich tovedu, and you and your father's household will perish. So what does she say? Okay, I'll go. Chasher avadati havadati, and if I perish, so I will perish. What is going on? Why all of a sudden is she excited and she has a change of mind? Why the change? And so just for today, I will share with you one response, one idea. And tomorrow, please God, will be part 2 of this discussion. And we'll have more interesting stuff to discuss. But I want to share with you one answer from the Malbim. The Malbim was a renowned commentary on Torah And don't forget, this is part of the 5 Megillas. This is part of Jewish scripture. And so he was disturbed by the impression that seems to come from Esther's hesitation. And he says as follows, Hashe'ela yoser enifla. The more astounding question is this, Eich lechir nafsha lamus b'shama of Eved Kol Yisrael. How was Esther not prepared to risk her life when she heard about the situation, the condition that the Jewish people were under the threat of destruction? She knew the situation and how dire it was because that was what Mordechai said to her. She didn't have new information. According to what we read in the Megillah, it was only after Mordechai manipulated her seemingly is she moved. And he says, what is her response? But I haven't been called to the king. I haven't been summoned in 30 days. He says that, listen to his words. He says, Utafa bli melach. He says this is like an unsalted meat. Now obviously there's more to Esther's argument, right? More to the entire dialogue that we see between Mordechai and Esther, right? It's possible to understand the conversation between Esther and Mordechai as hinging on the same ethical question that we are concerned with, that we're going to discuss more about tomorrow. Should a person risk their own life in an attempt to save others? That's the question. Should you risk your life in order to save others? Should Esther be risking her life to save the Jewish nation? And in order to understand that, we're going to have to continue our discussion, please God, tomorrow. And as we will see, this discussion between Mordechai and Esther is a discussion in the Talmud. And it's not just the dilemma that Esther had when she first was facing this question, but it's actually a way for us to try to understand the current situation in Ukraine. And it's a way for us to really try to understand in life which situations are critical enough for us to take action and to do whatever it takes, even if we're uncomfortable, even if it requires some risk, whether it's financial, personal, or even our life at risk. To be continued tomorrow. Just a second, we're going to end we'll take all questions after.